Most people need like 2 to 4 Airbnbs to replace the 9 to 5. And most people don't have money to go and buy 2 to 4 properties right now. But with the same amount of money that you could buy one, you could sublease like 4 or 5 properties and replace your 9 to 5. So again, number one, verify the regulation. Just you don't want your property, your business to be short-lived. So make sure you can get a permit, run the comps on the rentalizer, pitch it as corporate housing, and get permission in writing. And I say that because I've had a lot of people DM me on Instagram and they're like, hey, the landlord just found out I'm getting evicted now. I got to shut down my business. And like, that sucks. Is like, hey, you should have been upfront with the owner and just get permission in writing. So those are the 3 like most important things when somebody wants to go into arbitrage.
Hey friends, welcome back to the CarrotCast podcast. I'm your host, Brady Winder. This is the podcast where we help investors and agents build businesses of freedom and impact by dialing in your online marketing. And today I have with me Mr. Jorge Contreras. Welcome to the podcast, Jorge. How are you, man?
Brady, I'm doing great. Truly an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Everybody, this is going to be a really fun, good episode. So we're going to be talking about Airbnbs and short-term rentals today, and not just Airbnbs, but a lot of, I hear a lot of investors just kind of go into Airbnbs without a lot of, knowledge or insight. They're just, we're going to do this. We're going to see if it works. And sometimes it doesn't work and it could have been prevented. It could have been done better. So I'm bringing Jorge onto the podcast because he has doing this more efficiently and effectively than anyone I've heard of in our industry, as far as arbitrage and Airbnbs and automating them as far as systems and process, how to find your Airbnbs, how to make sure they're profitable, how to find the right ones, and how to get into them with no money. So this is going to be a perfect episode if you're just starting out in real estate, or if you're just wanting to start out at Airbnbs, how to do it with lower risk than just buying a property and less intrusive than house hacking. So that's kind of cool too. So yeah, it's going to be a good conversation. Jorge is the Airbnb expert. And so, yeah, we're going to talk about it. But first, before we get into it, real quick housekeeping. It's SEO month at Carrot. This episode has nothing to do with SEO, but we've put out a lot of great SEO content this month. So go to carrot.com/SEO to check that out. And then next month, we're going to be doing website design and conversion month. So we're all about conversion of your website to make sure that you're making the most of the leads that you're generating and that you're actually turning those leads into deals. But anyways, Jorge, he runs a 6-figure Airbnb business focused on arbitrage and automation, like I said. But what I want to talk about first, Jorge, is I got an email from you, or I got an email from your assistant about coming on the podcast. Went over to your website and I watched a video about your story, and man, it pulled at all of my heartstrings. It was so good. For the people that haven't watched that video or that don't know you, would you mind just giving us a glimpse into the upbringing of Jorge and kind of what drives you, like how you got to why you're doing this thing today?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of challenges in my upbringing. And I think it's great to talk about this because often you see people on social media just showing like the result or the success, everything above the surface. And you don't get to hear a lot of the struggles, challenges, and obstacles, which is how people can actually relate. And I think this will connect for anybody that is going through a chapter in their life where they're experiencing challenges and they feel like they don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But definitely experienced a lot of challenges growing up. Attended my half brother's funeral when I was 5 years old. He was murdered due to like gang related, stuff. And when I was 7, I was selling drugs with my dad. When I was 10, we were smuggling people into this country. And also when I was 7, my dad was an alcoholic his entire life. And the doctor told him that if he wanted to see his youngest son, Jorgito, grow up, he needed to stop drinking alcohol. And he did, but the damage was too far and too much. So when I was 12, he passed away from alcohol. And then when I was 13, my mother abandoned me. And I'm pretty much the youngest one out of all my brothers and sisters. Everybody after me, even though they were only like 14 and 16, they were like pregnant, already had kids. I'm the only one who graduated high school. And I graduated with like 4 Fs and 1 D, dropped out of college. I did 7th grade twice. So, and then a lot of the friends that I grew up with, like in junior high and early high school, they ended up like in dead, in jail, or just really messed up from like drugs and alcohol.
Sheesh. That is just well, one, I commend you on your storytelling ability because that's a lot to back into about 60 seconds. Two, I commend you on you are resilient, man. It's crazy to see where you are now.
Yeah.
Especially out of all your siblings and your families and friends group. What would you attribute, you know, to your success? Like what was the one thing that kept you going through that crazy upbringing?
Yeah, so I would say what kept me going is I didn't have anything to fall back on. So even when I was like,
Mm,
when I was 16, I was completely living on my own after my mom abandoned me. Her friend took me in. She said, "Hey, as long as you go to school," she said, "I'll feed you, clothe you, and put a roof over your head." And that was the deal. And then when I was 16, she said, "Hey, I've helped you enough. Now you got to look after yourself." I got my first job making minimum wage. I was paying $300 a month renting a room. And I just remember if I wanted to take a girl out on a date or just do anything, go out to a restaurant, like there was nobody there that I could go and ask for money. So it just, there was no safety net. There was no plan B. It was like, this is going to work because it's going to work. It just put me in survival. Like I didn't have an option. So that was a blessing in disguise. But what really helped me,
mm,
Brady, is that I had to change the meaning that I had given to my story. But because up until I was like 16, I always was a victim to my story. I'm like, I'm never going to be successful. I'm never going to amount to anything because that's what all my teachers told me because I always had bad grades. I wasn't,
mm.
I didn't have great attendance in school. And so I just believed what they were telling me. And I just didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I thought that life was just happening to me rather than for me. And so, of course, as I
Mm,
started getting older, I started going to a lot of self development trainings, did a lot of mindset work, a lot of therapy, and then I realized that all of these things actually happened for me and not to me. So, as I saw that at a young age, being at my brother's funeral and him being in like gangs, it was like, okay, well, don't don't surround myself with other gang members. And then growing up,
mm.
my dad was like in and out of jail for doing illegal businesses. It was like, okay, well, don't do anything illegal, just do what's right. And then like he would like cheat on my mom and that was normal. And we saw how much that impacted our life as kids. Um, just everything that she went through. So that taught me the value in, being loyal and just focusing on. So everything that I experienced, it was like, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't
Mm.
do that. So even today, I'm 35, like I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't cheat on my wife, I don't do anything illegal. And so it just
Yeah.
pointed me in the direction of do the opposite of what your dad did, and it became like the biggest blessing to just change the meaning that I had previously given to all those stories. So I think if people, everyone
Yeah.
that's been to like been through challenges, obstacles, tribulations, if we change the meaning of our story and of our past and realize that all of that happened for us and not to us, it's a game changer. It takes you from being a victim to your story to feeling empowered.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a firm believer in that too. Like the things happen for you instead of to you, because otherwise you wouldn't have the opportunity to share your story with other people and encourage them and help them as well. You wouldn't be here on this podcast talking about that. One more question, and we'll dive into the stuff people tune into the podcast for in the first place. But I love talking about this. Did some of that change or some of that motivation drive did that intensify when you had kids? Because you have at least one kid,
I have
right?
two. I have a
This one,
3-year-old
you have
daughter
two.
and a 6-month-old daughter.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. Did that, so growing up, your dad was not the dad that you wanted to be. Did that really light a fire
Oh
under you
yeah,
when you had kids?
totally. Like, and that's exactly what I always said is my goal is to be the father that I didn't get to have. So
Mhm.
for sure, like, and I think about it, when I travel to like conferences or if I'm not here for 3 days from time to time, I think about that. And it's always a reminder of my dad wasn't present. Like he was present for us partially, but he had kids with two other women and he was never present for them. Like when he died, I think he owed over $200,000 in child support. And this is back in like
Oof.
the 90s. So it's probably like
Sheesh.
close to a million with inflation adjusted. And they like never got to see my dad. And so I still to this day, right? They're all in their 40s. And I still see to this day how much their lives continue to be impacted by not having a father figure. So it's just
Mm.
crazy how much your life can be impacted by not having a father figure, but even more important, the meaning that you give it.
That's awesome. That's really cool, man. Thanks for sharing. I can relate. I got my son, he is 8, and like that drive, that motivation that comes from that, it's a blessing for sure. Anyways, we'll get into the Airbnb side. Thanks for having that conversation with me. It's really important. Like, Carrot's mission is is to help our members build businesses of freedom and impact. And so, I feel like it's 100% applicable to the conversation around Airbnbs, is because like this can help you buy back some time freedom, so that you can have a bigger impact and you can spend more time with your family, that freedom and impact. And so you're kind of living, breathing an example of how you've done this and bought more time back in your business. So anyways, getting into, so you run Airbnb, you're the Airbnb guy. I'm curious, what's your business model look like now versus when you started out getting into Airbnbs?
So when I started investing, that was back in 2012. I actually just posted Thursdays. I like to post a Throwback Thursday on my stories. And I have a picture with my best friend, who today is actually my property manager. His name's Ron, and it's his birthday. So I found a picture where it's like me and him standing in front of my very first house that I closed on May 23rd of 2012. So it's cool that you asked me that.
That was sweet.
So when I started back then, I was doing like house hacking, and I wanted to
Mhm.
just not have to pay the money out of pocket. So I got this house back then, 2012, 4-bedroom. I lived in the master, rented the other 3 rooms, which paid not only the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, but also the utilities. But I always saved those $1,800 a month that I didn't have to pay. And 2 years later, I had $43,200 from saving those $1,800 a month. And I took that, and rather than buying a Mercedes or a nice car or going on vacation, I did my first new construction project in the backyard in
Mm.
2014. And then that started to rent to a long-term tenant for $1,000 a month. So here I am, 2014, living mortgage payment free and making $1,000 a month from the back unit. And,
Did you build is this an ADU that you
yeah,
put in the back of your, okay,
yeah.
yeah.
So it was actually a recreational room back then. The ADU law in
Oh,
California didn't pass until January of 2017. So in 2014, even though my property was zoned to have 2 units to be a duplex, I didn't have the lot requirements. So they said, hey, you cannot have a second unit with the kitchen. And I'm like, well, what can I do? Because I've always been a big believer in do what you can with what you have where you are. They said,
mhm.
well, you can do a rec room. I'm like, what's a rec room?
Hmm.
They're like, well, it's like a room that you could use as a recreational room. You could use it for an office or an extra room, but you can't have a kitchen or a shower. You could have a toilet. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I talked to my contractor. I said, hey, we're going to turn this into an ADU or just another unit.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew what the term was back then. And so we designed it in the way where after all the inspections and everything, final inspection
Mhm.
passed, we added a shower, we added a kitchen, and boom, I started renting it for $1,000 a month.
Perfect. Yeah.
The powerful thing, though, the lesson there is that growing up, and I'm sure you heard this growing up, people always told me that money didn't grow on trees. And I had this belief that money was hard to make, it was hard to come by because of that, hearing that growing up. But I realized in that moment, because after I rented that unit for $1,000 a month, it was like a 40% ROI. So in 2.5 years later, after building it and renting it out, I got my $30,000 back. And so now I
Mm.
got my money back. I'm still making 1,000 from the back now in net profit, and I'm still living mortgage payment free. And I realized that money does grow on trees if you learn how to plant money seeds. And I learned at
Mm.
that point that everyone who told me that money didn't grow on trees were simply projecting their limiting beliefs and, lack of results on me.
Yeah. That's cool. That's awesome, man. So you got that first property, you built the unit in the back. And so now so when you got into Airbnbs, what did that look
Sure.
like?
So, my first business is I used to be a professional dancer. And at the time, I had a choreography company. And one of my dancers, who was a performer in 2016, she owned 2 duplexes in Fresno, California. Her name is Nicole. And she mentioned to me that she was making 3.5 times on Airbnb compared to what she was making with like fair market rents. And I thought that was crazy. I'm like, I got to look into this. So there was very little information back then online, like in 2016, about short-term
Mhm.
rentals. I tried to consume everything I possibly could. I had a few leases in 2017. At that point I had 3 houses for a total of like 6 units, right? So like I lived in one, my mom lived in one. I bought her a house, and then I had 4 units that were all long term. So I put all 4 of those units on Airbnb in March of 2017. So it's going to be 6 years pretty soon. And I went from making $1,500 in gross rent per unit to $3,500 in gross rent. So from 6K
Sheesh.
to 14K. And I was like, what is going on here?
That's
So
wild. And how many, I don't wanna throw you off, I'm just curious for context. How many days out of the month were they booked?
I would say probably about 22 days, like about like
Okay,
just under 70% occupancy.
okay.
And all of these units at the time were like 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. And I was hosting like about 6 people on average. And I think on one of them, I pushed it up to 8. I
Hmm,
told them in the description, hey, I know it's a lot of people, but if you want to save some money, it's a great place. And if you guys can shower
yeah,
in 1 restroom, you guys can make it work. It'll be great.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's what I did. And, these properties were all in Southern California. So, we have, they were in somewhat proximity to like Universal Studios, Disneyland, near
Yeah.
downtown LA for 2 of the units. So they were in great locations and they did really well. And then my next goal was I wanted to scale faster because at the time in 2018 I wanted to replace my wife's 9 to 5. She was a law enforcement officer. We wanted to start building a family, but in her government job, say her shift was going to be done in 15 minutes, they would say, hey Lucia, you have to stay for another 8 hours, and there was nothing she could do. And so we knew that that was not going to work out. I would always joke that I would be with our kids at Disneyland while she would have to work. And I'm like, I got to do something about this. So my goal was to get more cash flow and replace her 9 to 5. And I didn't have the capital to keep buying more properties like every few months. And so I came across this arbitrage strategy. And I'm like, okay, so I can rent properties from owners, get permission in writing in the lease agreements. Because in all lease agreements, it says no subleasing. But I was like, well, what if I talk to them and I actually get their permission and I just let them know, hey, I got strong financials, strong credits. I'm going to be responsible. I'll set up the property on auto pay. If there's any repairs or damages, I'll put in the lease that I'm going to be responsible. And so in early 2019, my business partner Jaime and I went and we launched like 7 subleases, and that was how I
Hmm,
was able to like replace her 9 to 5. It was strictly a cash flow play, right? We didn't have the equity or the appreciation, couldn't do bonus depreciation with cost segregation from owning the real estate. But at the time, that was not important to me. I'm like, I need cash flow to replace my wife's 9 to 5, and that's what
mhm.
did it. And then what's cool is having all those subleases actually helped me, compound my savings and grow my savings, so I can then go and buy a ton of real estate. And now I have a portfolio of like close to $8 million in like single family homes that are all on Airbnb.
Wow,
So
that's crazy. So the first objection that pops up in my head is you said, I heard this arbitrage model. We did 7 of them. The first thing that pops up for me is most landlords wouldn't have a reason to say yes.
right.
How many out of the ones that you ask are saying yes, and how do you get them to say
Yeah, it's a
yes?
great question. It's going to be a numbers game. So we get about 25 to 30% of landlords that say yes. And I've never done flips or wholesale myself, but I have some really close friends that do. And they shoot
Mhm.
out like a ton of offers, and they're like, yeah, man, we look at 100 properties and from there we submit. So from 100 properties that they look at, they say they close on like 1, right? So it's a
Yeah,
numbers game, whether you're flipping, wholesaling, even if you're a loan officer or a real estate agent, like it's always going to be a numbers game, right? And so with our Airbnb
yeah,
arbitrage, about 25 to 30% of landlords say yes. And you get everything in between, from people that are completely open to it to people that hang up on you and say, don't ever call me, and then everything in between. But one
yeah.
of the things that really helps us, and I think this will help the audience, is we don't say, hey, we want to rent your property and do Airbnb, because the landlord is going to think that it's going to be a party house, right? We've
Yeah.
all heard on the news once or twice about this crazy party that took place. Unfortunately, these landlords probably came across one of those videos, and now they think that's what you want to do in their property. So we always pitch it as corporate housing, because we want them to understand that we truly only work with professionals that are coming to the property. That could be a family, it could be a legitimate company, it could be nurses traveling for work, relocation companies, government bookings. Or nurses traveling for work. But we don't allow any parties or any events. Even if somebody wants to do like just anything for
Bachelor
like
party or
just nothing with music, and we don't allow people other than those on the reservation. So we really only do work with professionals. So when we pitch it as corporate housing,
Mm.
they're a lot more receptive to the idea.
Interesting. That's, honestly, I'm familiar with the numbers in regards to wholesaling. And so those are much better numbers than I would have thought, like 25%. That's admirable. And I love how you pitch it as that, not only pitch it as that, but that's what the business model is. I was going to ask about lowering risk. And it sounds like that's one of the ways you do lower risk is having those strict standards on your Airbnb,
Right.
as opposed to, hey, we got an Airbnb, come on, come all.
Exactly.
Um, so what are the splits like, between you and the landlord?
Yeah. So typically what we do is we pay them the fair market rent. So if their property is being advertised for, say, 3,000 a month on Zillow, that's exactly what we pay. Personally, I've never
Mm.
paid more than what they're asking for, only because in real estate, we always want to have multiple exit strategies. And so
Mm.
when I first started, I used to launch Airbnbs in a lot of gray areas where Airbnbs where they weren't issuing permits, but they also like weren't illegal. And I
Mm.
got caught with my pants down one time where I launched an Airbnb. And again, it was a gray area. And 6 months into the lease, they implemented a regulation that no longer allowed me to operate like one day to the next. And so what I did
Mm.
is I put it as a long-term rental on Zillow, and I got a tenant for 12 months who was paying $500 more than what I got the lease for. And mainly because I had furnished it, right? So we put like 15 grand in like furniture. And the crazy part that was at the beginning of the pandemic. So we're coming up on almost 3 years of making $500 a month from a long-term tenant. So
Sheesh.
that
Yeah.
so when I got to experience that, it was like, and see again, that's another example of, hey, things don't happen to me, they happen for me, right? Who wouldn't like to make
Right.
$500 a month in net cash flow
Uh-huh.
from a property you don't own without doing
Uh-huh.
Airbnb, right? And so for that
Yeah.
reason, I always only want to pay fair market rent because I need to have that as like a backup strategy in case anything ever happened. So I always pay for fair market rent. So if I'm paying them 3,000 a month and then I'm making say 6,000 a month, of course, after I pay for utilities, cleanings, replenishables, my goal is to make about 2,000 a month in net cash flow per property. That said, we only go for properties in primary locations that are near theme parks, the beach, downtown. All of my properties have pools, jacuzzis, and a game room. And we host 8 to 12 people, which allows us to charge a higher nightly rate and have a higher profit margin.
So you're only going after those larger groups. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're paying the landlord around 3,000, and then you said the 2,000, that's your net?
Net cash flow.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so that makes sense. Um, I'm curious about some of the automation. So how many Airbnbs do you personally have right now?
Yeah, we have 18. So we own 8, sublease 7, and manage 3.
Okay, so what are you doing to streamline the process and kind of buy back some of your time there?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So there's three operations in a short-term rental business, right? Two of them, you need somebody in person, and the third one is virtual. So the two in person is, of course, somebody to clean and someone to do maintenance. And I recommend to build an in-house team, which we'll talk about in a second. But as far as the automation, I got the cleaner, the maintenance person, and then I got a virtual assistant in Mexico. Only because I used to have VAs in the Philippines, but they're 15 hours ahead of Pacific time, and it was a
It's
bit of a
hard, yeah.
challenge with the time zones. So by having
Uh-huh.
somebody in Mexico, South America, Central America, the time zones are going to be very similar to like Pacific and Eastern and whatnot. And what I
Mhm.
did is I created a Slack channel. So you got the workplace, right? Like the company name, and then each channel is a property. So we have
Mm.
18 channels. And if I go in, channel number 1, people know that anything that we talk about pertains to that property. So I have the cleaner, the maintenance, the VA, myself, and the property manager. And we are in all 18 channels. And this way, everybody communicates with each other. So the VA will come in here and be like, hey, Claudia, somebody's asking if they can check in early, if they could check out late, if they could drop off the luggage. And they all just communicate with each other. And then, of course, whenever something more important needs to be done, that's when my manager steps in. And my manager is like a really strong operator integrator. I can honestly delete the Airbnb app off of my phone. Like I am not involved. We don't have weekly meetings. Like he's just a doer, and he's really good with that stuff.
Mm.
So that's how I've systemized it. And this allows me again to like work on the business and not be so involved in the business. And like right now I'm working on a couple, developments and going into the multifamily value add stuff. And if I was like 18 properties is a lot of freaking work if you're doing it yourself.
Mhm.
And, I want to continue to grow my portfolio and go after bigger deals, and not being involved here allows me to go and do other stuff.
Absolutely, it's scalable, and I love just it's funny, I'm in a Slack in and out of it every day, and I wouldn't have thought to, do that with your properties like that, having a one Slack channel per property, and that way you don't have to worry about, "Oh, which email thread was that in? Was
Exactly.
it this for? That reply? Like, where is that conversation?"
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because
that's
in the
incredible.
beginning, we were using WhatsApp, but it was the same team for like 3 or 4 properties, and then that it's exactly what you just said. They're like, "Oh, which
Yeah,
property is this for?" So then we just switched to Slack, and now each property has its own channel, and it's all under one workplace, so it makes it super easy to handle communications there.
absolutely. So just clarify real quick for me, what is the VA doing, or what's the difference between what your VA is doing and then what your property manager is
So I
doing
have my
locally?
VA focus on like those lower income activities that are tedious but necessary. So like I don't need a manager to answer, hey, can we check in early? Can we check out late? Hey, can we get
Mhm.
more tile? So a lot of that tedious stuff, I have the VA do. She
Mm.
will send in the check-in procedures, checkout procedures. She'll remind them of the checkout time, just anything before, during, and after as far as communications. Now, let's just say there's an issue. Actually, just yesterday, I was talking to my property manager, and he was telling me that he found like a mice in one of the, or like a rat in one of the units. So when it's something like that, like, which is super rare, right? But he goes in there, he steps in, and he actually went to the property, because and he set up some traps, when the guest checked out before the next guest checked in. Normally he would have called a professional, but he's like, dude, they're checking in like the same day, and I want to catch this thing. So like he just went,
You're like, "Hey, don't mind me, I'm just getting the rats."
so he went over there and just handled it, right? And yeah, anything that requires someone in person, he's very hands on, because again, my VA is in Mexico, so that's kind of how we split some of those roles and responsibilities, and together
Yeah.
they work, really well. And this way, we also protect his time, because if he was doing all the communications, I think he wouldn't be able to handle the whole portfolio. It would just be a lot of work.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like you've got, those roles and responsibilities dialed in and separated well. What are you doing? So we talked a little bit about buying criteria. Maybe we could talk about that a little more. But you mentioned, larger parties. They have to have a pool or a hot tub. How are you finding these properties?
Yeah, so we find the properties on Zillow for everything. It just makes it easier. Obviously, all the inventory is there. The only thing I don't like about it is that the filters don't work when you're looking for properties with like pools, or even the
Mm.
description. So that's why a lot of times I'll actually use like other platforms like Redfin. Super easy. The filters work. They're 100% accurate. So I'll go in there
Mm.
and I'll type a city and I'll put, hey, 3 bedrooms, 2 bath, minimum 1,100 square feet. It must have like a pool, and then and that's about it. And then I start looking for everything, and I focus on the acquisition. So I'll look for it myself. I'll find the property I like. I'll talk to the landlord myself. Once we sign the lease, everything else is done by my team. So my team will put together a furniture list. They'll order the furniture, coordinate that everything goes in from once Amazon delivers. They'll assemble, they'll do the decor, be there with the photographer. They'll create the listing for me. So they have, my login and password. They'll create the welcome books, and they're like, here you go, here's the listing. And then my manager obviously takes over management. So again, I can focus just on those high levers, which for me is acquisitions.
Mm. And it sounds like, I'm guessing you've got your systems and process, your playbooks dialed in as far as this. You're not just winging it and hoping that they can figure it out, but you've created systems for
Yeah,
this.
exactly. Like I have the same team that's been launching all the, for the last 3 years for me. So when we get a new property, it's typically in one of like the same areas. So it's the
Mhm.
same cleaners, the same maintenance people, the same. We just plug
Nice.
and play to the same system. So it works good.
That's awesome. That's crazy efficient.
Yeah.
Anything else as far as buying criteria, you know, that we didn't mention?
As far as purchasing criteria, like purchasing the real estate,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I guess for somebody that's just getting started, like I've done this a couple of times where similar to when I bought my first property 5 years later after that one in early January of 2017, me and my wife bought our first property together. And at the time, we weren't married yet, but we were engaged and we didn't have kids. And we also I wanted us to leverage the mortgage payment so it didn't have to come out of our pockets. So same thing, we got a 4-bedroom
Mhm.
property with 2 bathrooms and we did a split home ADU, right? So
Mhm.
we were able to, close the hallway, open a door where there was no door. We converted one of the bedrooms into a kitchenette slash living room. And so we kept the main living area, dining, kitchen, the master bedroom, backyard, all that. And now we got 2 rooms, and the middle room was the kitchenette slash living room, and then it had the bathroom, but it was completely separated. It was like a duplex, and we started renting that out on Airbnb. And we were able to set up the bedrooms were fairly big, so we were able to fit in 2 queen beds in each bedroom, and we were hosting up to 8 people. I'm like, I know if I can host more people, I can make more money. And again, most of the
Yeah.
time it was like 4 to 6 people, and sometimes people were like, yeah, we want to save money, and it would be 7 or 8 people. They would always park in
Uh-huh.
the street. I was like, don't park in the driveway. But for 3.5 years of having that Airbnb there, we saved 3,000 a month. So we saved over $100,000 in mortgage payments over the course of 3 years. And again, I'm mentioning this because if somebody out there wants to go and buy a property with 3.5% down FHA or 5% conventional, do some house hacking, turn one unit into Airbnb, live
Mhm.
in the rest of the house. I know everyone's largest monthly expense is where they live. So if you can get
Mhm.
rid of a $3,000 mortgage payment, man, that's like a huge, huge, huge win, right? And then those
Mhm.
100,000, we rolled it over and then acquired more properties, right? So that could be
Mhm.
one strategy for anyone that's looking to buy, and to buy with less money to have more money to then buy more deals.
Oh, heck yeah, man. I'm a big proponent of instead of first looking at it as like, how much more money can I make? It's like, how can I reduce my monthly expenses first? How can I really get efficient every month? Everything from cars to house to, get rid of all the fluff and how can I make more money on the, you know what I mean?
100%.
Um, yeah. Let's talk about risk if you don't mind. So I know, people think about doing Airbnb. They're like, oh, well, especially where I'm at in more of a rural market, it's a little different, but they're like, well, what if I can't rent it all the time? How do I keep it full? And would I even make that much money? But there's also risk of like seasonality, depending on
Yeah,
what market you're in. There's also risk of like what laws and regulations are going to come down the pipeline, like you mentioned, um, in the previous story. So, what kind of risks do you face, and what are you doing to kind of, be ready to pivot when
sure.
those regulations or things
Yeah,
happen?
one of the risks is regulation, right? I would stay away. And again, when I first started, again, there wasn't as much regulation as there is today, but I see it as a blessing because today I only launch in areas where I can get a permit. Because in the past, right, I learned from that experience where 6 months into the lease, they changed the regulation and then I couldn't operate. And then it was like, okay, I don't want to keep building businesses, investing time, money, and resources to something that is going to be short lived. So a risk is
Mhm.
launching in areas where it's a great area or launching in areas where you shouldn't be launching in the first place. So really the way
Mhm.
to avoid that is again, only launch in cities where you can get a permit. That for sure is like a big risk. And the good thing is once areas have regulation in place and you can get a permit, whenever they do make adjustments, they tend to be very minor. Um, the changes are major when there is no regulation and they implement one and they could likely not be in your favor. The other thing is as far as the actual numbers, just like when you use the MLS or different resources to get the comps to figure out the ARV on a wholesale or on a flip, we look at 2 softwares to get the numbers to extract the data, and that is Mashvisor, which works everywhere in the US except Puerto Rico, and then AirDNA works worldwide. And so with AirDNA, they have an area on the rentalizer, and you can plug in an address, and it'll tell you what the projected revenue is for the next 12 months based
Hmm.
on similar properties in bedroom count, bathroom, square footage. location, amenities, and all that stuff. So that's what makes it really cool. So if you're going into an area, say like Big Bear, California, or Poconos, like New York, um,
Mhm.
they're gonna those are gonna be like seasonal areas where during, like in Big Bear, from November to May you can make a ton of money, but on the other
Yeah.
months, like, it's gonna be really slow. But if you're looking at
Mhm.
what those properties did over the last 12 months, and it says, hey, this property is projected to make, $80,000 over the next 12 months, and you're gonna have, $40,000 in rents, then it's a no-brainer.
Mhm.
So that's why I like using those softwares, because it helps, mitigate, some of the risk. And our goal is to be able to generate double whatever we're going to pay in rent. So if I'm going to rent a property for 5,000, I want to see that there's already properties making 10. If I'm going to rent something for 2,000, I want to see other properties are already making 4,000.
That's awesome. That's a really good tip. Thanks for sharing that. Are you, yeah, especially for places like Big Bear. I mean, there's a ton of places like that, where we are in Oregon or down in, Nevada, these little ski resort towns, have you found that to be pretty reliable, or are you still trying to couple that with like talking to locals? Um,
I would say
yeah.
it is very reliable, especially because these are like paid softwares. I think if they were free, I
Mhm.
would be like, but they're pretty expensive.
Yeah.
Like, these softwares are pretty
Yeah.
expensive. Like, Match Finders are like 800 a year. And with
Mhm.
AirDNA, I mean, we have the worldwide subscription, but you could buy just per city and it could be like 20 or $100. But with the annual worldwide subscription, it's like 7,000 a year.
Oh,
Um,
wow. Mm.
that said, the numbers that you're getting right now, from AirDNA, based on the last 12 months performance, right? The last 12 months is very different than these next 12 months. So I'm telling my students to, subtract like 30%. So if it says that
Mhm.
property is projected to make 100, you should only account for like 70, because people are spending way less money right now. And we're having to bring down our prices, right now, um, in order to be competitive, because people are just not spending as much
Mhm.
as they were 6 or 12 months ago.
Yeah, people are tightening their belts, and postponing vacations that they were going to take because it's getting more expensive.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, what one of my questions was, how do you, if I guess it'd be for your students, because it sounds like most of your Airbnbs are local to Orange County. How are you forecasting future demand for other markets?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's two things that we do. The very first thing is to look into the regulation and then the numbers. So what we do is we just have them go on Google and look up the building department in that city. So if somebody wants to
Mhm.
launch in Dallas, California, they go on Google and type building department in the city of Dallas, and then the phone number will come up. And then that's who you ask, hey, what's the regulation? Can I get a permit? Are you still issuing permits? What's the process? How long does it take? How much does it cost? And then if you can get a permit, then the next thing is you go on the rentalizer on AirDNA, look at the projected revenue, subtract 30% just right now for the recession. And then after that, if the numbers still make sense, then you can pretty much replicate that in any market.
Mm. Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. And asking for a friend, these gray markets you mentioned, what's the is this just counties or cities, building departments who haven't decided their stance on Airbnbs? Like if you can't pull a permit, but it's not black and white that it's illegal, do you get a slap on the hand? Do they are they even looking for those? Like,
Yeah, that's super interesting, because and it's funny because when you call the building department, they'll say, well, we're not giving it, we're not issuing permits, but it's not allowed. And we're like, okay, can you point me in the area on your website where it says that short-term rentals are banned? And they're like, well, they're not really banned, but they're not allowed. And that's how it's like a gray area, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so again, it depends. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, if you're living in an area right now and it's a gray area and you're going to move out of that property, and like you already own it and it's like, dude, it's already furnished. I'm going to buy furniture for the new house that I'm going to move into. Might as well
Mhm,
give it a shot on Airbnb. It's like, cool, just ride the wave, right? Because you have nothing to lose, everything to
mhm,
gain. Um, and in most places, they won't issue you fines unless it's actually banned, because then you're like violating a regulation, right? Like in the city of New York, although it is changing, and in New York, and same thing, they're also changing it. Right now, they're banned. So they can give you fines, I think $500 to $1,000 per day right now in those areas. Um, but they are changing both of those regulations to start allowing short-term rentals, which is good. But if it's in a gray area and it's not banned, they can't really fine you for something that they don't have, a ban for. So it's one of those things
Interesting.
where, depending on the situation, you could just ride the wave for as long as possible. Like I did that. The house that I mentioned earlier that me and my wife bought 5 years ago or 6 years ago. It's still on Airbnb and it's still a great area. There's you can't get a permit, but it's also not banned. So we're just riding that wave for as long as possible. And honestly,
Yeah.
I don't think they're gonna they're gonna like do anything. So some cities,
Uh-huh.
I think they're just gonna stay that way. It's just not really a priority. Um, because it's also not taking up, like, there's not a lot of Airbnbs in some of these cities. I think if it gets to the
Mhm.
point where, hey, 20% of the inventory or 10% of the inventory is taken by short-term rentals and they're taken away from affordable housing and they're creating
Mhm.
a supply and demand issue and it's getting more expensive, then I can see something happening. But until that happens, it'll just be on a city by city basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I guess my last question would be as far as looking at the future, anything you see coming down the pipeline for Airbnbs, or is there going to be more demand for it in the future or less? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I always look at, and I like to go into the Airbnb app and kind of look at who is booking our properties. And one of the things
Mhm.
I notice frequently is that a lot of people who are staying at our Airbnbs are staying at an Airbnb for their first time. And I know
Hmm.
because it tells you when their account was created. So it'll be like, hey, this person created an account in January of 2023. Like they don't even have a profile picture, there's no reviews. And you're like, oh, it's like it's a new person who maybe just discovered Airbnb.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's a great sign because people are realizing that this is an alternative way to have an experience, have a vacation other than a hotel. And so I think they're like, and of course, even when I just meet people all the time, they're like, "Oh, I've never stayed at an Airbnb." So I think as long as we have a lot of that demand, which I believe we will, I don't think there's going to be an issue.
Interesting. That's good to hear. That's really insightful. Because to me, I've stayed in them and I think, Airbnbs, like, that's our norm. I like staying in Airbnbs versus a hotel, even if I'm not even saving money, because I just like the experience more. But I forget there's still masses of people who just never stayed at one. It's mysterious to them.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Anything you would want to add? People should know about
Yeah, sure.
Airbnbs?
Yeah,
Anything?
I would say like there's really three main things. If somebody wants to get into Airbnb arbitrage, and again, just to kind of preface this, my goal for everybody here listening is to own as much real estate because there's no doubt that's where you want to be. That's where you're going to create long-term wealth, have that equity, that depreciation, and that's how you create long-term wealth. That said, most people I know are not in the position to go and buy. Like most people need like 2 to 4 Airbnbs to replace a 9 to 5. And most people
Mhm.
don't have money to go and buy 2 to 4 properties right now. But with the same amount of money that you could buy one, you could sublease like 4 or 5 properties and replace your 9 to 5. So again, number
Mhm.
one, verify the regulation. Just you don't want your property, your business to be short lived. So make sure you can get a permit, run the comps on the rentalizer, pitch it as corporate housing, and get permission in writing. And I say that because I've had a lot of people DM me on Instagram and they're like, hey, the landlord just found out I'm getting evicted now. I got to shut down my
Oh,
business. And like, that sucks. Is like, hey, you should have been upfront with the owner and just get permission in writing. So those are
yeah.
the three like most important things when somebody wants to go into arbitrage.
Mm. I appreciate you sharing that. I think that demystifies a lot of what could be a very mysterious and a lot of unknown. Um, yeah, that's awesome, man. So you teach this, you coach students through this. You're the guy to learn from. Where can people find you?
They can find me on Instagram. My handle is like THE and then Jorge Contreras. So the Jorge Contreras. And make sure there's no underscores or any of that stuff. It's just my name.
Awesome. Well, thank you, man. I appreciate you sharing that. Everybody listening, hope you got value out of this. I enjoyed that conversation. Jorge, thank you for sharing your story. I appreciate that. I know that was impactful for our audience. So, um, anyways, everybody listening, if this was valuable, share with a friend, and we will see you next week.
Thank you guys. Have a good one.